Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We will be discussing today what organizations could do to both prepare better and manage uncertain times and situations like the one that we're experiencing right now. The speakers today for this webinar will be Dr. Rob Fall and Dr. Imo Ilevbare. They are both based at the Institute for Manufacturing. The Institute is a division of the Engineering Department at the University of Cambridge, and we conduct research, teaching, and also practical application of our research. We work internationally with many companies, governments, and universities.
Thank you, Nikki. Hello, everyone. So in the next half hour or so, we'll be covering these topics, an introduction to road mapping and scenarios, which are both useful tools for planning and strategy when faced with uncertainty. And we'll be thinking about also the application of these methods together in the context of COVID. So I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Imo Ilevbare, halfway through. So what is a roadmap? Well, here's a nice simple example for space exploration. This is actually from an international collaboration across the world published by NASA. And they've published a few reports over the years, over an 8-year period, including roadmaps of various kinds. And this is a nice simple example, very high level message. And what's interesting about this one is it does show that there's some optionality still in the plan, 2 possible routes to Mars. Another interesting aspect of these roadmaps is there are different levels of roadmap for different purpose. This is level 1, the top level view. So if you need to give a 2-minute overview, this would be the roadmap you use. I put a question mark at the end there because although getting to Mars is of course a complex technical challenge, in many ways from a road mapping perspective, NASA has it quite easy because the goal is very clear, get to Mars. Where we are now is very clear, on Earth. And so they're really dealing with the pathway from the current situation to the future. But in many situations, the future is very uncertain, and that's the context we'll be focusing on a bit now. So methods that you can use for planning and strategy in times of uncertainty. So here's a level 2 roadmap. That previous roadmap's good for high level communications, but it'll never actually get you to Mars. So this map is about the collaborations between these different space agencies around the world and what they need to do together to achieve this. And below this, there are even more detailed roadmaps, which are closer to program planning, so actually functional roadmaps. And that's really good practice to have this layered effect where you progressively reveal more information depending on the purpose to different stakeholder groups. But often this kind of structure is not seen. So I'd always recommend that. When you look at a lot of roadmaps, it's a very flexible tool. You can find some common patterns. So this is a sort of general framework we tend to adopt. Where on the one dimension, the horizontal dimension, you can see the time horizon, short, medium, long term, looking into the future. Roadmaps always have a time dimension. I've just highlighted that those timeframes are often associated with what's called horizons, horizon 1, 2, and 3. That's common in sector level foresight. If you look underneath the roadmap, you'll see some very fundamental questions in red there relating to the time dimension. Where do you want to go? Easy for getting to Mars. Where are you now with respect to where you want to go, which defines the gap. And the middle of the roadmap is there to find ways and pathways to bridge that gap. The roadmap won't give you answers, but it provides structure, a structured canvas around which you can support dialogue and communication. On the vertical axis on the left, you can see we have a whole lot of layers or perspectives. These are all of the key elements of your innovation system that have to somehow synchronize over time for success. And what the words I've shown there are typical themes you might see in an industry roadmap. On the right-hand side in red, you can see that the 3 very broad layers in blue, yellow, and green there relate to some other fundamental questions. The top of the roadmap by convention is trying to address the question, why do we need to act? What the motivation, the trends and drivers affecting us, and also the particular needs we're trying to address with our strategy. The middle of the roadmap is the very tangible, what should we do? Classically, that might be what kind of product, what kind of functionality, what kind of performance do we need to address that need? And the lowest part of the roadmap is there to bring in all of the resources you need to achieve those goals, answering the question, how can we make that happen? And technology is a big part of that in many roadmaps. And what you do in the middle is always a balance between the market pull and the technology push, trying to resolve a good solution which meets a need, but is also possible. On the very left here, we can see that these layers typically relate to stakeholder views. And that's why this is such a powerful communication tool, because it brings all of those views together, focusing on the dependencies between what people are doing in their particular part of the system. And the way I like to think of it now is that everyone holds a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and naturally they will understand their piece well. They may magnify its value because of their position, but they may have limited understanding of the other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. And very importantly, what does the picture on the front of the box look like? And it's very hard to do a jigsaw puzzle without that picture. And that's what a roadmap is essentially. It's the jigsaw puzzle picture on your strategy to show how all the elements fit together. As well as communication, roadmaps are very useful for integration because they have a solid systems foundation, which is represented on the left, and are very holistic. So what you find is most information that's relevant has a position on the roadmap, but it can also help to integrate that information, but also tools and processes. So any other management tool that's relevant, you can usually understand better if you map it onto the roadmap structure. And typically these other tools, and I've just highlighted some on this little schematic, have more analytical power to address particular question marks which arise on the roadmap. And so you typically need a tool kit so that the strengths of one tool can address the weaknesses of another. And then the simplest configuration for a toolkit is to use the roadmap as a integrating knowledge hub. So when you're confronted with a question mark, you can go and use another tool that's designed to resolve that question mark, and you bring that knowledge back onto the roadmap. The one example we're going to be focusing on later is on the right-hand side. If there's a big question mark there, which is confounding your ability to strategize, then scenario planning is the go-to tool really to help manage the risks associated with that long-term uncertainty. And so on the NASA example earlier, that question mark I put there is to highlight this point that you need another tool really to help resolve the future states. Now, road mapping has a design dimension shown at the bottom here that you should always consider. On the very left extreme, some roadmaps are purely based on expert opinion, and they can go a long way, although there may be analysis gaps, of course, just if things are based on opinion, but often a very good first iteration can be produced that way. Typically, you'll need more analysis, and at the other extreme, there are very data-centric, analysis-rich methods. And I think a balance between the two is necessary, and you need to decide for your application what the appropriate balance should be. On the very left-hand side here, we have a photograph of an expert opinion-based process where we're using the roadmap structure to moderate that dialogue. And on the right-hand side is a digital equivalent where online you can replicate these kind of processes using standard off-the-shelf digital tools so that you can get the benefits of this sort of dialogue even in situations where you can't get together, such as now. So I'm just showing the schematic of the roadmap because one of the pitfalls in road mapping is it's easy to over-polish the roadmap for communication purposes, but there's a risk that it can become rather static, and roadmaps are always out of date, and the best ones sometimes are the ones that are always clearly work in progress, used dynamically to support decision making. There's no value in the artifact itself, it's what you do with it. And the process of road mapping is there to using these structures to support decision making in strategy and innovation processes. So if you're not iterating through and using it live to support decision making, then it can be quite a expensive waste of time potentially. So we would always advocate really a light touch, agile, iterative learning approach. And it's a very good diagnostic because road mapping is actually quite a simple tool. It helps you with complex, challenging problems. And your ability to complete a roadmap is really a completeness check on your strategy. So if I've ever given a nice glossy strategy document, I chop it up with a pair of scissors, start putting it on the roadmap, and you start to find where the gaps are, where the linkages are not clear, and so on. And that tells you where you need to focus to improve the quality of your strategy. So that little quote at the bottom from a Philips manager, they were very influential in road mapping. It's a strange term really, but a manager there referred to roadmaps as a dirty mirror, because you hold it up and you see yourself as an organization. And you may not like what you see, but don't blame the tool. You should be grateful that it's revealed a weakness that needs to be addressed. And some of those may be in systems that take quite a while to fix. So road mapping can be a bit of a journey of resolving the quality of your strategy and strategy processes to get a good quality roadmap. If we think of this, the main focus of this talk, which is about strategy under uncertainty, strategy generally is pretty challenging because it's very complex normally, lots of elements, lots of moving parts, a lot of ambiguity. And what I mean by that is that there are many people involved with different views, different motivations, different backgrounds, and communication is a major barrier and source of conflict. And there's lots of uncertainty as well. On the right-hand side, we're just highlighting two sources of challenge in the quality of information in the roadmap. Firstly, the future is inherently unknowable. Of course, you can do forecasts, but they break down. And so that you have to deal with and confront that uncertainty head on, especially on the right-hand side of the roadmap. And scenario planning is a tool that can help with that. Also, it's very important to realize that even today, you do not have perfect information. Information costs money, takes time, and there'll be different perceptions in the organization of what is known. And that leads to information asymmetries, quality issues in information, and a lack of situational awareness. So you need to work on both of those to provide good intelligence, to understand what isn't known and what's important, but also to start to grapple with the longer term uncertain future. So the model we find very useful is this one from a Harvard Business Review article quite some time ago from Courtney and colleagues. And they identified a nice simple 4-level model. Level 1 is the lowest level, clear enough future, and then upwards. What's nice about this is they've given these little schematics to indicate tools really that are suitable for this different levels of uncertainty. So in level 1, basically forecasts work on the left-hand side of the roadmap, but they tend to break down. As you move further out, you have to start thinking about decision trees and possible alternative pathways. So options thinking and analysis can become very useful here. At higher levels of uncertainty, more on the right-hand side of the roadmap, then scenario planning, where there may be a range of possible futures are relevant. And of course, there should be a connecting narrative between the short, medium, and long term, the horizons 1, 2, and 3. But you need to use road mapping and tools in a different way in those horizons. Level 4 is true ambiguity, and still there are tools there that can help to understand the nature of the environment, reduce that ambiguity, and also approaches in terms of building resilience, agility, and so on that can cope with that unwelcome situation. I've just sort of put a bit of a timeline there showing how, as a disruption such as COVID has emerged, we're basically going to be moving down these uncertainty levels, and different kind of techniques will be appropriate as the future becomes clearer. And different tools, as I mentioned, are relevant. The nice thing about road mapping is you can use it for all of those levels of uncertainty, but you need to use it in a different way each time. So thinking about COVID, that's a kind of a fairly classical, what they call a black swan disruptive event. And in that bullet point there, I'm just highlighting there's how do you deal with black swan events before they arrive, anticipating them, versus managing them. And we're in the second phase there, we're managing a disruption. But if you go back a year or two and we're trying to prepare for this kind of event, you would need to anticipate it. And basically what you do is sort of poke your baseline roadmap with that disruption and see what effect it has, and then try to build mitigating actions and insurance into your baseline scenario to mitigate against those uncertainties. In terms of managing disruption, I've just used those horizons 1, 2, and 3 there, picking out the different sort of epochs on the roadmap. The exact dates are a little bit uncertain. It'll depend on how things pan out and also where you are in the world. But on the Horizon 1 period, we're really in the crisis management. And their road mapping has a role to play in program and project planning, really. And that is to provide a strategic view of how all the pieces fit together. In Horizon 2, we're into a transition management phase, although you need to know where you're transitioning to, of course, which is Horizon 3. And there we're into sort of classic, I guess, strategic road mapping, thinking where some options approaches would be useful to show how you deal with different possible pathways moving forward. And Horizon 3, we're into transformation management, big steps. And there really you need to be able to pin down possible future states, desirable and maybe undesirable, so that you can come back to today and start thinking about what we can do. And then somehow you have to stitch together these three horizons so that even in the crisis management, you're sort of investing in the longer term future as well. So the last slide from me, I just had a quick look around the world for emerging roadmaps, and I positioned them against these three horizons. So on the left, a really nice roadmap template from UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which is fairly generic. It's intended for helping organizations and countries to quickly repurpose existing assets. And it's very generic, so depending on what the asset is and how you want to repurpose it, this template would provide a good starting point. I like it because they've taken on board the why, what, how thinking, and so it's quite a coherent template. In Horizon 2, you can see lots of examples around the world of some elements of transition, basically out of lockdown. The bottom two there are quite similar, one from the USA, the other from the UK, where they're using the infection curve as a strong visual device, and we're on the downslope there and phased, how to get out of lockdown in a phased way. At the top, from Ireland, it's a really nice functional roadmap, which is breaking that down for each sector, so that in parallel, they've localized the advice for different sectors. And you can imagine that being the middle part of a more complete roadmap. But for communication purposes, you may not want to communicate everything. You pick and choose what's important. On the right-hand side, I've got two interesting things here, not specific to COVID. At the top there, it's actually a retrospective timeline of what happened after Ebola. And so, of course, COVID is not the same as Ebola, but we can learn from previous pandemic responses and try to understand which of those, if any, might be applicable in a new situation. So you can learn from the past using by mapping with road mapping. And the final example at the bottom right there is a science-based roadmap looking at the personalization of immunology. And of course, if that succeeds in the medium to longer term, that could be a very useful capability moving forward. So focusing now back on uncertainty, the focus of this whole talk, and the very useful tool to combine with road mapping, scenario planning, I'll hand over to my colleague who's been working in this area quite a long time, Dr. Imo Nevbari. Over to you, Imo.
Thanks, Rob. I'm just going to get my screen up. Yeah. Good. Can you see my screen? Anyone give me feedback? Yes? Good. Thanks, Rob. Hi. So, yeah, thank you, Rob, and thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar. So Rob did talk about road mapping and how it is very useful and helpful for dealing with very complex situations. And that is absolutely true. With roadmaps, you can break down what will be a very complex issue or organizational system into its functional parts that will then give you a chance to actually see what's going on and how you then could plan forward from that. So in itself, road mapping is actually a very good tool for dealing with uncertainty and managing risk. But there are instances and situations where it needs a bit of help. And a situation where, for example, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few months, especially maybe regarding COVID and other things that are going on, you probably need something else just to add on to the roadmap. So I'd like to introduce to you, if you don't already know, scenario planning. Scenario planning is a great tool And it was actually made famous by Shell. They used scenarios in the late 70s to in a way prepare themselves for the oil shock that came in the early 80s, late 70s, late 70s. So it's been a tool that's been around for a while, and it's been very useful for many organizations. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is what many people would call a scenario funnel. Some people will call it a cone of possibility or probability. Comes in various guises. But what basically it is saying is that today we know where we are. We are right now at a single point in history. And with enough information, you can approximately tell what is going on around you right now. But as you look into the future, you're probably going to encounter endless possibilities of where things could end up. And therefore, how do you make sense of that, especially when there are real implications to yourselves, to your organizations, on these future states, plausible future states? So scenarios really help to facilitate decision making under these sort of conditions where the future could be almost anything. And it will help you narrow down a range of possibilities into a few pictures, if you like, of the future that you could actually plan against or plan towards. In normal times, the future is complex as it is. Normally, you're probably wondering about automation, digitalization. How do I deal with skills or the lack of? How do I reshore, or what do we send offshore? How do we deal with new technologies that are emerging on a daily basis? So it's already complex, isn't it? But then when you add on top of it two things that are probably, if you're in the UK especially, a bit of concern and a headache at the moment. Brexit, which a bit now is in the background. COVID is the main thing. How do you deal with that? How do you, on top of everything else, how do you consider Brexit? How do you consider COVID and so on? And so just like road mapping helps you to make sense of complex situations, scenarios can help you even more in situations like this to help you make sense of what the future might look like. And this is an example of scenarios created in which the entirety, within the context of the organization for whom this was created, the entirety of the future was reduced through a systematic process to 4 possibilities. And each of those you could see in a quadrant there. Now, so what you get is a more structured view of the future. And believe me, it is much easier to plan based on 4 possibilities than endless possibilities. An example of this actually is one that has been created by one of the universities in the UK. And they have created 4 scenarios as regards COVID and how to respond to it. So on the left-hand side there, top left, you see a rapid recovery. That's assuming, for example, that the economic recovery is fast and the virus gets under control. And on the bottom right-hand side, you see global gloom, a sluggish economic recovery and a loss of control of the virus. So you could consider those 2 as extremes. Now, it's not unlikely that when you're faced with creating scenarios, you decide to create best case and worst case scenarios, and maybe 1 or 2 in between, or you actually just go for neutral scenarios where any of the 4, if you're looking at 4, are equally plausible. What you should note here is that scenarios could be created at various levels of abstraction and organization. So you could have scenarios created for the entire UK. You could have scenarios created for a certain sector. In this case, this applies to the education sector. It could be for just one organization, as Shell did, and as many other organizations have done since then. So if you're wondering, how do we create scenarios? You could do it for yourselves, but even if you did it for yourselves, just for your organization, you need to put into context. It needs to be developed against the context of what is happening in the wider world. But narrowing it down to your organization is very useful if you can do so. Now, if you were to have scenarios at hand, the question is, how do you use it to plan? How do you perhaps integrate it with road mapping? And an example of how we have, on one hand, developed scenarios and also used it, you'd find in a document. You can see the link up there. But if you just type into your browser future scenarios for the UK food and drink industry, this will come up. And you will see in there how we have used some of our agile workshop-based techniques to develop and use scenarios. When it comes to actually using the scenarios with road mapping, there are two general modes of application. One is to start with scenarios and try to develop a roadmap for each one. And this we call scenario-led road mapping. So you have a scenario for each roadmap, a roadmap for each scenario, and then you try to align all those, say, 4 roadmaps into one central roadmap that would include bifurcation points where things can, if one scenario starts looking plausible over the other one, you can choose a certain path and align your investment decisions or other decisions along that pathway and so on. Of course, this is very high level description you're seeing here. There are techniques that we'll use to make sure that this is possible. The other way to do this is, in fact, to start with a roadmap, a baseline roadmap that maybe you have created for your organization based on your best understanding of the situation at the moment, or in fact, based on your aspirations for the future. So you might have a goal-driven roadmap, and you want to test that against what might happen in the future. Now, if you have good scenarios, or if you, let's say, plausible scenarios for the situation at hand, you can then test that roadmap against the scenarios. And what you end up with is a modified, more robust roadmap, which will take into consideration the various possibilities. An example of this is what you can see here. You might be able to see at the very top there. Again, this is all publicly available, and that's why I can show it to you. There's a lot more we've done that we cannot share publicly, but this here is actually one that we created based on 4 scenarios. The 4 scenarios I showed you earlier, you can see that thumbnail at the top there. And there are several strategic responses that were tested against the 4 scenarios. So CZ stands for Cloud Zero, and so on and so forth. So 4 scenarios named accordingly. Now the question is, how do these strategic responses, maybe in your case, investment decisions, how to manage your staff, or how to structure your organization, things like that, how do they play out, or how might they, what is their strength across the scenarios? And this way you can see how perhaps some responses are more resilient across the scenarios than others. And therefore you can go for those ones that are more resilient across. And in this case, the ones highlighted as very high, perhaps are the ones that you will want to invest in first. That is not to say that the others are not important. As time unfolds and the future becomes clearer, it will become clearer which of the scenarios the future is looking more like, and therefore you can manage your responses accordingly and align your investment decisions as you go into the future. So the use of scenarios and road mapping they go very, very well hand in hand. They are very similar conceptually in what they're trying to do, but they need to be monitored. They need to, you can't just create a roadmap and leave it gathering dust. It's not useful. Similarly, you can create scenarios. If you're going to put those scenarios to use, you need to keep monitoring the situation, monitoring how things are emerging, so that you can change your roadmap and your strategy accordingly. So key things to note in using scenarios with road mapping. You want to build in flexibility, you want to build in robustness, you want to build in resilience in your decision making. Identify commonalities across the scenarios or the scenario roadmaps. And by this, I mean things that are critical to all scenarios you probably should start doing anyway. This we found out in terms of, for example, platform technologies, that regardless of how the future is going to play out, you probably are still going to need things, for example, depending on your industry, maybe to do with digitalization or maybe artificial intelligence or robotics. It's still going to happen. So identify commonalities, but also you need to identify the significant differences where the scenarios or the way the scenarios might evolve or the future might evolve would really have an impact on what decisions you make now or what investments you need to pursue. And then trying to decide or identify what signals and triggers you look out for. That is part of the scenario building and development process. Identifying the weak signals, the signals that once they happen, you have an idea that, okay, the future is going in this certain direction and I need to modify my strategy accordingly. So these are just some high level things that we look out for and we would recommend to you to do, to look out for as well. But remember that food and drink industry scenarios, that's available on the web. Have a look through it. It is very detailed in terms of the methodology. And we'll be very, very happy to discuss something perhaps similar for you or your organization, or if you have questions on how to carry this forward for yourselves, let us know. In conclusion, as I said before, you don't just create a roadmap and leave it on the shelf. That doesn't work, especially if it's a roadmap that you've created for actually making strategy and for executing decisions. If it's just for information, okay, maybe fine. But if it's for actually making decisions and taking action, you need to review it often. Similarly, for your roadmap, for your scenarios, you need to do so often. Now, how do you do that without getting fatigued? And this is where the lean agile toolkit approach that we use becomes very useful. There are some key principles that we follow. Everything is very human-centric. We depend on expert opinion, expert information, people coming together to work. You can develop scenarios and roadmaps using computer simulations and all of that. That is fine, but we've also found countries, research bodies that have tried to do that in certain parts of the world, especially in Asia, come back to us to say we're lacking something. There's still a dimension that we're missing. And that's why we think there's something in people working together and having consensus and creating strategies together. Because if there's consensus, it's more likely for the strategy to be executed by people. For people to work together, we like using workshop-based processes. Now, COVID notwithstanding, we are still running workshops and we're able to do so by virtue of technology, and we're very happy that there is available technology to do this. So we can run workshops remotely. They're live sessions, but they can be done remotely. These will be facilitated, likely processed, scalable, I talked about before. You can create roadmaps and scenarios for your organization, for a business unit, all the way up. We've done this at national levels as well. And our processes are very visual. Even though they are remote, they're still very visual. We use a lot of templates and so on. And you can see an example of that on the screen right now. So this is the approach we follow, an agile lean approach where you can do things over and over again quickly, rapid prototyping, and making changes as the situation evolves. Yeah, we found this very, very, very useful. So this, in essence, is the end of we talking. Myself and Rob and Nikki will be very happy to take your questions. To do that, if you have questions that you'd like to submit, there is a Q&A button on your. You should be able to see that on the bar at the bottom of your screen, the bar, black bar there. So you can submit your questions that way. Rob and I will be very happy to answer. Just for your information, you might want to attend other webinars we have upcoming. So we have make or buy, make versus buy, especially when it comes to supply chain reconfiguration and resilience. That is very important for these times. Manufacturing sustainability as well. And if you want to call us, that's our phone number right on the screen there. We'll be very happy to discuss with you how we can help you. And we're primarily a non-for-profit organization, so we're very happy to work with you either on research or practice. Rob, Nikki?
Yes, we have a couple of questions actually that have been posted. One is, what is your experience in using road mapping in context involving many, often conflicted stakeholders from different organizations? For example, sectoral roadmaps, cluster roadmaps, public partnership roadmaps, and how to avoid early lock-in in such situations.
I pick up the first one. If you recall the design spectrum I highlighted from expert opinion to data-centric, the photograph there, it illustrates the process we found very useful for multi-stakeholder conflict-ridden situations, which is almost always the case. By involving all key stakeholders in the conversation, it has a tremendously positive impact on resolving some of these issues, which would be probably more damaging in a more data-centric approach. Now, of course, you won't necessarily always get agreement, but you can quite quickly identify where stakeholders agree and when they don't agree, and that resolves a lot of the conflict. And then it's possible to, for example, say, well, if there's a lot of disagreement, there's an interesting issue there to focus in on, but it doesn't stop you looking at the big picture at the same time. So things like scenarios are useful for that, because if there is disagreement, that might well reflect uncertainty in the system, and you can explore the extremes of that disagreement. The issue of lock-in is really critical for all strategy, and it's not specific to road mapping, but it's important always to not feel too pleased with yourself when you get agreement, because you may be all working to a false assumption. So any healthy strategy process should have a challenge element to it. In the original Motorola roadmap paper, for example, they required that a consensus-based roadmap was delivered. In other words, it's no good just sitting down and writing one. You have to consult with people to get all the stakeholder on board, but you must also deliver what they call the minority report, which is designed to address that sort of lock-in. So any strategy process tends to go through phases of divergence and convergence, and the divergence phases are there partly to make sure you don't lock down on a solution too early.
Okay, thank you, Rob. The other question is how to integrate road mapping with executive political commitment to action. Maybe for you, Rob, again, or?
Okay, we've done a lot of work in companies and in government and other agencies, and it's always about involvement in the process. So we've always tried to get very senior endorsement and involvement. If you think of the roadmap structure, who owns the whole roadmap? Well, it immediately goes to very senior people who are responsible for the integrated activities. So the best solution is to, right from the beginning, involve those key decision makers and so on. If it's not possible to do that, then people are one step away from where they want to be. And quite often what people do is devise a roadmap based on their best understanding and assumptions, and then take that roadmap to those stakeholders to use the roadmap as an engagement mechanism. And this is true not just for seniors, but if, say, if you're in a technology intensive firm and you need marketing input, if you can't get that from the start, then a similar approach is what people tend to use, because that knowledge is crucial, of course, for the overall roadmap.
Okay, thank you. Another one for Imo, maybe. Road mapping requires specific capabilities. What is your experience in integrating capacity building in the road mapping process? Could lessons from organizational learning be helpful?
Yeah, I'm muted. Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. So the question was, what is our experience in integrating capacity building?
Yes, correct. Capacity, well, it says requires specific capabilities. What's your experience in integrating capacity building in the road mapping process?
Okay, so my understanding of this question is that if you were going to carry out road mapping or implement road mapping in your organization, what sort of capabilities or capacity would you need to build in your organization to do so effectively? If that's the question, my answer will be that there is a need to understand that, especially if you're coming to road mapping a bit green as an organization, that the use and the development and the use of roadmaps in itself is a change, should be regarded as a change to the system. It's going to perhaps, in some sense, shock the system a bit, and therefore you need to manage it like a change management program. But that is not to say that it is difficult. You simply need to be very clear. It usually is very helpful if you have someone who is particularly driven and who is key to making it happen. So someone like a champion who then has very clear goals as to how road mapping is meant to be used within the organization. It's going to be used as a single sort of episode, or it's going to actually be used to run the organization's strategy development and delivery. So there are things that you would need to recognize, that you would need people who can actually, in one sense, road mappers, but people who have the ability to look at complex situations and be able to, in a way, put them on paper. People who are also able to facilitate this road mapping workshops, especially since we like to do road mapping as people-centric processes. So the capacity will definitely be, at least you need someone who is interested and who can champion it, and preferably that person should be trained in road mapping, and other people who are able to support the process. I'm not sure if I've properly answered your question. Perhaps Nikki and in fact Rob could say something to that effect.
I don't know, I think
for me, I think it's a learning process and it's different in every organization.
Okay. Another one for you, Imo, perhaps. Do you give any credibility to the process of super forecasting in predicting the future? And if so, what are the important attributes we should look for in these people?
Well, that's controversial now, isn't it? Super forecasters, the Mr. Cummins and co. I honestly don't know how not truthful is the wrong word, but how quote unquote accurate super forecasting is. What I can tell you, however, is that in doing scenarios, and in fact sometimes road mapping, what you can do by way of research is horizon scanning. And by horizon scanning, you are looking at various trends, drivers. You are bringing in people who should know. Perhaps you want to bring in a super forecaster, but we tend to bring in people from all walks of life. Many sometimes from the creative industries, people who are into filmmaking, storytelling, because actually you'd see from history that a lot of things that are playing out now were quote unquote predicted in movies. Of course, a lot of things predicted, said in movies also in the past haven't happened. So there's value in bringing together diverse minds, but there is definitely value in doing proper horizon scanning by way of research using the right people. Super forecasting, I really don't know. I don't know enough about it to say yay or nay to that. Rob, perhaps you can say something about super forecasting.
Yeah, well, I presume some people have crystal balls tucked away in their coats, and I'm a bit suspicious myself until people can prove they are accurate. They can, maybe it's very convincing. But I'd like to just highlight another related type of person I don't bump into very often. It's always puzzled me, called futurologists. They write great books about what the future might hold. But I don't see that kind of function very commonly in normal strategic planning. But I went to a very interesting launch of a research lab once by a corporation. They had an invited speaker who was a futurologist. And then I realized really what I think the real use of that type of person is. And it links back to the lock-in question above, is I think the utility of a futurologist is to whisper alternative futures into the CEO's ears, maybe, to again say that the future may not be the same as today. And that seemed a very useful thing to do related to that earlier question of keeping your peripheral vision high.
I think the key thing to take away from this, or one of the key things to take away, is bring in as many diverse minds as is reasonable to do so, and with people who know how to do foresight and futures, they could guide you in doing that. But definitely don't just stay with people in your organization. Look out, bring in a range of people. And if you do meet a super forecaster that you trust, why not?
Okay, thank you. So another question is, how do you get engagement throughout the organization? Not only the key stakeholders, but the whole organization. Maybe Rob can answer that.
I'll start off. This is often a big issue for organizations. Quite typically, we don't actually see many very wide deployments. I think more commonly, we tend to find pockets of application in big firms where people are basically dealing with the issues under their scope of responsibility, just because of this sort of going back to an earlier question about senior support. If you could, without that, it limits the scope of what you can do. So when I do come across that sort of situation, the first logical thing there, if there are pockets of activity, often they don't know each other, is to try to join those up and form a community of practice. Now, to really get it uptake in an organization, you need to start to make sure that the road mapping is really used for key decisions. If it becomes part of your decision-making armory and it's useful, then people will use it more. And so you want to align it with your, say, stage gates in your innovation process, your annual strategy cycles, and so on. Otherwise, it'll just always be a peripheral tool. Quite often firms should be a bit patient because it takes a long time to deploy these sort of systems. And another person at Philips once told me you should think big. You know, imagine what this could do for the whole organization, but act small. Take small steps, experiment so the risks are low and the investment is low, demonstrate success, customize the approach. And that internal demonstrator can be quite powerful for engaging other communities in terms of how, so they can understand what this tool might do for them.
Okay, two sort of related type of questions. One is, do we have any examples or publications we can provide of how we combine agile and lean techniques with roadmaps, especially in service companies? And another one, integration of road mapping and scenario planning, sort of stories, case studies.
So the second one, the integration of scenarios with strategy, I wouldn't say primarily road mapping, because we don't quite have one in the public domain on that, although we do have a paper that I think we can share a link to that paper in maybe about a week or so, because it's going to be published on our internal system on how to combine scenarios with roadmaps. So if the person who's asked the question is willing to drop their email, we'll be able to send a link to that paper. But the example I shared before of the scenarios for the food and drink industry will give a reasonably good idea of how you might evolve, or how you might translate scenarios into decision making. It's an interesting read. It's a bit of a long read as well, but there's some key parts of it that, especially on the methodology, that you might find interesting. Could you remind me the first question?
It was around integration of, agile and lean techniques used to develop a roadmap, especially in service companies.
Yes, so what we have is the application, in essence, is the application of agile principles and lean principles to develop roadmaps and scenarios. To give you, we can again provide some publications or to demonstrate that, but I don't think we have any that is at hand now that's spelled out to say lean and agile combined with road mapping. We use the principles of lean and agile in road mapping. Rob, perhaps you want to add to this?
Yes, I would say that road mapping sits comfortably in both traditions of lean and agile, which have co-evolved in any case. Originally road mapping, I would say, more emerged out of the lean tradition, the sort of hardware manufacturing world where systems thinking is very prevalent. But also if you go into a factory, you see visual management boards. You know, if you can't see it, you can't manage it. So I think there is I would position the mainstream road mapping as emerged out of lean, and I've seen companies independently make that step themselves from their lean practices. Now in agile, it's a little bit different because agile in software has developed a little bit independently from hardware, and the road mapping I see that's only come out of software is a little bit limited compared to what we've been talking about, because software moves so fast. So generally software firms don't have to deal with that long range uncertainty. They can test ideas out very quickly in the market. So minimum viable products is a way to reduce risk, and if your clock speed is very quick like software. And also because of the pace, software roadmaps from agile tend to be somewhat on the timeline, mainly around the product release dates and feature sets. So they don't really have the why, how thinking that has come out of the lean tradition. The key thing, if you want to apply the more sort of sophisticated systems thinking in road mapping into an agile environment, is cycle time. So if you can iterate fast enough to fit in a sort of agile cycle time, then it'll fit fine. Those photographs we've shown are all based on processes where we have iterating very fast. So we don't get a final roadmap immediately, but let me just get a slide back up. Anyone will do. So we didn't develop it as an agile practice, but it could fit into an agile system, and that's a critical factor, I think. If you just go into the classic agile world and try to adapt agile practices that are specific to hardware, software in other environments, people often struggle. You need to adapt those processes.
Okay. Another question, maybe for Imo, is how do you determine the KPIs for your roadmap scenarios that deliver the agreed outcomes and behaviors?
So determination of KPIs is something that we've been working in, and it depends on how you consider your scenarios, or in fact, their combination with roadmaps. Now, many organizations would look at scenarios as exploratory scenarios, and some will look at scenarios as things they develop to map out their own future. And in that sense, they are out there by themselves, forging the way ahead in uncharted territory. So they say, regardless of what is happening, this is the future we want for ourselves, and we're going to get it. Of course, you consider what is happening in the context of day-to-day things. Why am I bringing that up? You can use the scenarios, not just to understand the future, but to prescribe for yourself a vision. You can use it to clarify a vision for yourself. You can use it to clarify your objectives. How does this link all the way back to KPIs? To develop KPIs, you need a clear vision. You need to be able to break that vision down into a set of objectives. And it is those objectives you have for your organization that would determine the KPIs that you set in motion. So back to the question, how do you bring in, or how do you determine KPIs within the context of a scenario or roadmap? I would say use the scenario to craft for yourselves or clarify for yourself a vision. And then for each scenario, you can map out what are the relevant objectives and therefore the KPIs. Now, given that the future is uncertain, you will need to find a way to align or at least to play in parallel the various KPIs depending on how the future ends up or how it tends to be emerging. So sort of a long answer to your question, but I hope it brings some clarity.
Okay, and maybe another one for either of you, or maybe Imo. How do you embed circular economy principles in scenario building for, say, manufacturing strategy implementation? Do you have any examples of combining circular economy principles in scenario planning where the main subject wasn't directly sustainability related?
In some way, this comes back to how you develop the scenarios in the first place. For any scenario building exercise, there needs to be a focus. It's probably going to be your organization, it's probably going to be an issue in your organization. But in fact, regardless of how focused that issue is, you still need to position your scenarios in the wider context. And by wider context, you might be familiar with the acronym PESTLE or STIPLE. And one of the letters in that is E, which stands for environmental or ecological. And that is the sort of the segue into sustainability issues and discussing the circular economy. So the primary focus of your roadmap or your scenarios might not be sustainability or the circular economy, but in fact, I think you need to consider that, at least in the wider context, and positioning your scenarios and also your roadmaps ultimately against that context. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Okay, a couple more final questions. Maybe I'll pass that on to Rob. Shouldn't we be more worried about what happens off the road as well? We have been missing a few weak signals that cause large disruption like Brexit and COVID-19.
Yes, I think this touches on the earlier question about lock-in. It's a sort of part of making sure in any strategy or innovation process that you extend your peripheral vision. It's very easy to just sail down the same path and then suddenly be sideswiped by some problem. It should be possible to buy some insurance against that if one spends some of one's strategic time thinking about those sort of things. It'd be impossible to guarantee it, but if you've got your sort of sensors out for weak signals, it's certainly possible to do what-if kind of scenario analysis on them using road mapping to say, well, imagine if a pandemic arrived, what would we do, and so on. So it's about a strategic protection, I guess, in any organization to try to avoid that. But I think it's very easy for people to forget. So it should be on a big checklist of never forget to do exactly that.
Okay, one more practical one for Imo, perhaps. It says, in an organization with multiple products, which can be both standalone but also synergistic, do you recommend different roadmaps with inputs either from the overarching organizational requirements or the standalone inputs as scenarios to inform decisions for the individual products?
That was a long question. Could you repeat the last part? Could you recommend?
When you have a lot of products, would you recommend different roadmaps with inputs either from the overarching organizational requirements or the standalone inputs as scenarios to inform decisions for the individual products?
Okay, so when it comes to road mapping, and in fact scenarios, we did say that these techniques or methods are scalable. And one way of interpreting that is that you can have different levels of roadmaps within the organization. You can have a roadmap for the entire organization. You can have a business unit, and you can keep bringing it lower and lower down. You have a roadmap for a product. In fact, sometimes a component, an important component in that product. So in creating a roadmap for a product, or if you already have a roadmap for a product, One thing that we are quite particular about is that that roadmap is linked to your business strategy, your overarching strategy, I think, as you put it. And if there were to be scenarios considered or used in developing that overarching strategy, it should flow down to the roadmap. If you want to bring in scenarios afresh to look at your product strategy, yes, by all means, do it. So I would say there is actually no harm in, if we were creating a product roadmap, we would have as one of the information perspective of, or things we bring into the roadmap, we bring in what is the business strategy? Is there anything around the business that would inform how this product should be developed? You could use scenarios to test that business strategy, because it is that would inform your product strategy and therefore your product roadmap.
Okay, and I think we are on time, exactly 3 o'clock. It was one final question, but we don't want to delay people that are joining us for this webinar. So maybe we'll be closing here the session. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying with us for the whole hour and posing very interesting questions. If you have any additional questions or you require any particular information from us, please email the team and we'll be trying to respond as quickly as possible. Thank you very much.